Good afternoon, everyone. It's Tony Consola here again in Geneva for our weekly press briefing. Welcome to everybody. I'm joined by Alexandre de Juniac, our Chief Executive and Director General, as well as Nick Careen, who's our Senior Vice President for Airports, Passenger, Cargo, and Security. As usual, we'll have a few short presentations followed by a question and answer session. This week we'll begin with a few remarks from Alexandre before we hand over to Nick for the second presentation. So Alexandre, can I ask you to take the floor?
Yes, thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this weekly briefing call again this week. I want to share today with you a declaration from our Board of Governors. IATA has some 290 members, and the CEOs of 31 of those members are elected to serve on our board, and they have come together with a united voice in a declaration of 5 key principles for the eventual restart of aviation. So let me read them out for you. First, aviation will always put safety and security first. Airlines commit to work with our partners in government, institutions, and across the industry to implement a science-based biosecurity regime that will keep our passengers and crew safe while enabling efficient operations. Ensure that aviation is not a meaningful source for the spread of communicable diseases, including COVID-19. Second, aviation will respond flexibly as the crisis and science evolve. Airlines commit to work with our partners in government, institutions, and across the industry to utilize new science and technology as it becomes available. For example, reliable, scalable, and efficient solutions for COVID-19 testing or immunity passports. Develop a predictable and effective approach to managing any future border closures or mobility restrictions. Ensure that measures are scientifically supported, economically sustainable, operationally viable, continuously reviewed, and remove or replace when no longer necessary. Third, aviation will be a key driver of the economic recovery. Airlines commit to work with our partners in governments, institutions, and across the industry to re-establish capacity that can meet the demands of the economic recovery as quickly as possible. Ensure that affordable air transport will be available in the post-pandemic period. Fourth, aviation will meet its environment targets. Airlines commit to work with our partners in government, institutions, and across the industry to achieve our long-term goal of cutting net carbon emissions to half of 2005 levels by 2050 and successfully implement the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation CORSIA. Fifth, aviation will operate to global standards which are harmonized and mutually recognized by governments. Airlines commit to work with our partners in governments, institutions, and across the industry to establish global standards necessary for an effective restart of aviation, particularly drawing on strong partnerships with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, and the World Health Organization, WHO. Ensure that agreed measures are effectively implemented and mutually recognized by governments. So this declaration is important because it demonstrates the industry's unit of purpose and commitment to work with our stakeholders to safely reconnect our world. We hope that it will send a strong message to governments that they must also work together. COVID-19 is a global health crisis and a global economic crisis. Aviation is the crossroads of both. It is critically important that aviation restart operations in a safe way. Shortly, my colleague Nick Careen, Senior SVP for Airport, Passenger, Cargo, and Security, will explain the passenger experience in our proposal to safely restart operations. The restart will go much more smoothly if governments cooperate. As I have said before, we must avoid the mess that followed September 11 when governments acted unilaterally. This created confusion for airlines and travelers alike, and it took many years to clean up. We have a small window to avoid these mistakes with COVID-19 by agreeing global standards for a restart. In doing so, we must build in measures for continuous review so that we can streamline the system as science and technology evolve. There is reason to be optimistic. The International Simulation Organization is leading an initiative called COT, that is the COVID-19 Aviation Recovery Task Force, and it is working well and fast. Our proposals are in support of that process. If we are successful in a smooth restart for aviation, that will pay big benefits in solving the economic dimension of the COVID-19 challenge. The shape and size of the industry may change as a result of this crisis, but aviation will remain a critical support for vast sectors of the economy. The sooner we can safely reconnect the world, the more jobs can be saved. And combined with economic stimulus packages, a reconnected world will be a solid foundation for economic recovery. With that, I will turn it over to Nick to talk about a layered approach in biosecurity measures for the safe restart of flying. Thank you for your attention. Nick, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Alexandre. I appreciate it, and good day to all. The next few slides will represent, as Alexandre had indicated, the airlines industry's effort in identifying a roadmap to resuming operations. Based on our long-standing commitment to safety as our highest priority, its success depends on partnerships approach among the key participants in the travel chain. Almost every challenge in aviation requires a team effort to solve it. Today, we face the biggest challenge in commercial aviation's history, restarting an industry that has largely been ceased to operate across borders, while ensuring that it's not a meaningful vector of the spread of COVID-19. Meeting this challenge will mean making significant changes across air travel experience, be it pre-flight, at the departure airport, on board, and post-flight. It will require governments to assume broad new responsibilities in terms of assessing and identifying travelers' health risks, as governments did for the security after 9/11. Airlines and airports will need to introduce and adapt processes and procedures to minimize contagion risk in the airport and aircraft environments. And passengers will need to be empowered to take more control of their travel journey, including responsibly assessing their own level of health risk before that journey. So our goal, collaboration, is absolutely critical. Governments will need to work together to implement internationally consistent, mutually accepted measures that are essential to restoring air connectivity and passenger confidence in air travel. Governments and industry will need to work together, particularly to ensure the practicable development and implementation of such operational measures. It is a matter of urgency. Successfully restarting our air passenger travel while restoring confidence in the safety of air travel are vital prerequisites to enabling the global economy to recover from COVID-19. In normal times, aviation delivers 2.7 trillion in global GDP. Every one of the 25 million airline employees or industry employees helps support 24 other jobs in the broader economy. More than a third of global trade moves by air. And today, airlines are providing irreplaceable services in the fight against COVID-19 by transporting critical medical supplies, including personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals. When this crisis ends, aviation needs to be ready for another role, helping to restore battered economies and lift people's spirits through the power of travel. We hope this roadmap is a useful tool in that effort. In terms of our logic, the recommendations we're presenting here are outcome-based. They are not prescriptive. They draw on the current understanding of how COVID-19 is most commonly transmitted, and therefore, what are the risks needed to be mitigated, and what are the best solutions to do this effectively? Because presently there is no silver bullet solution, we are recommending a layered approach for the initial restart, as it is already done in terms of how we've managed safety and security in the past. We should avoid unnecessary redundancies of measures and ineffective remedies. As improved risk mitigation methods become available, more burdensome and less effective measures should be replaced. We believe that the roadmap outlines a risk-based approach that assures that aviation continues to be the safest form of long-distance travel the world has ever known, and that it does not become a meaningful vector for the transmission of COVID-19. In terms of our guiding principles, this roadmap is guided by the following. All measures should be outcome-based, supported by scientific evidence and robust-based risk assessments. Health screening measures should be introduced as far upstream as possible. This will minimize the risk of contagion in the airport environment and ensures that most passengers arrive at the airport ready to travel. Any measures that need to be applied during the travel process should be applied prior to departure rather than on arrival. And to re-emphasize, collaboration is vital. Among governments to implement internationally consistent, mutually accepted measures is essential to restoring air connectivity and passenger confidence in air travel between governments and industry, particularly to ensure the practical development and implementation of operational measures. Measures should only be in place for as long as deemed necessary. All measures should be reevaluated under a fixed schedule, and when more effective and less disruptive measures become available, they should be implemented at the earliest opportunity and defunct measures removed. Existing roles and responsibilities of governments, airlines, and airports should be respected in implementing the response to COVID-19. In terms of our approach, we're looking at a temporary multi-level biosecurity measures. Because, as mentioned earlier, there is no silver bullet solution. So therefore, IATA recommends a temporary multi-layered approach during the restart for the health and safety of passengers and crew, and to ensure that air travel, again, is not a vector. So we've identified each individual touch point, and I'll go through each one briefly and what that looks like. In terms of pre-flight, we foresee the need to collect more detailed passenger contact information, which can be used for tracing purposes. This is crucial. Where possible, this data should be collected in an electronic form and in advance of passengers arriving at the airport, including through potential uses of extended uses of e-visa or ETA's electronic authorization platforms to enable that. IATA strongly recommends that states set up government internet portals in order to collect the required passenger data using internet-based technologies. This would allow the use of a wide range of devices for the data capture: computers, laptops, tablets, mobile phones, etc. Upon check-in, passengers should complete as much of the check-in process as possible before arriving at the airport. This will minimize the time spent at the airport, and therefore governments should remove any regulatory obstacles to enabling such things as mobile or home printed boarding passes and electronic or home printed bag tags and personal data capture online. At the departure airport terminal access should be restricted to workers, travelers, and accompanying persons in situations such as for passengers with disabilities, reduced mobility, or unaccompanied minors. Temperature screening should be implemented at entry points to the terminal building to be as efficient as possible. The screening must be carried out by professionally trained staff who can decide if a passenger is fit to fly or not. In addition, the screening staff need to have all the required equipment at their disposal. Physical distancing needs to be implemented according to the local rules and regulations. As a minimum, IATA recommends ranges from 1 to 2 meters, 3 to 6 feet, in conjunction with the local airport authority. The passenger flow through the terminal, check-in, immigration, security, departure lounge, and boarding needs to be modified to ensure physical distancing. Airports Council International, as an example, has published many examples of this already. While the guidance on the local health authorities on the use of masks and protective equipment needs to be followed, IATA recommends the use of face coverings for passengers, along with suitable PPE for airline and airport staff. In observance of local rules and regulations, airports, airlines, and governments need to cooperate to ensure that equipment and infrastructures are sanitized appropriately. The frequency of sanitizing should be established, communicated, and appropriate resources need to be put in place to enforce it. This applies to what you would expect, the normal touch items, carts, trolleys, e-gates, self-service kiosks, fingerprint readers, wheelchairs, trays, etc. An effective COVID-19 test, as an example, or immunity passports would be a future key to unlocking the complexities that we're describing here today. Unfortunately, a COVID test is not available at this point in time. That gives us fast results that could be applied on the entry to the terminal. This would enable an airport environment to be considered as sterile. Therefore, as this is a measure that needs to be incorporated into the passenger process as soon as an effective test is available, which has to be validated by the medical community and future developed. However, as we know, this is not the case today. As well, IATA in principle believes that immunity passports could play a role in further facilitating the restart of travel. However, the medical evidence regarding immunity from COVID-19 is still inconclusive, so immunity passports are currently not supported. At such time as the medical evidence supports the possibility of an immunity passport, we believe it is essential that a recognized global standard be introduced and corresponding documents be made available electronically. In terms of the airport processes itself, as mentioned earlier, physical distancing should be implemented both at check-in counters and self-service kiosks. At airports, self-service options should be made available and utilized as much as possible to limit contact at all passenger touch points. A general move towards greater use of touchless technology and biometrics should be pursued vigorously. Where baggage self-service devices are in use, airlines should proactively guide passengers to self-bag drop options to minimize interactions, minimize physical handovers of baggage between passengers and check-in agents. Boarding will change as well. An orderly boarding process will be necessary to ensure physical distancing, especially once load factors start increasing. Here, good cooperation between the airline, airport, and government is vital. Airlines will need to revise their current boarding processes to ensure physical distancing. Airports will need to assist in redesigning the gate areas, and governments will need to adapt any applicable local rules and regulations. The increased use of automation, such as self-scanning and biometrics, would be great facilitators. Especially during the early stages of the restart phase, carry-on baggage should also be considered to be limited to facilitate a smooth boarding process with physical distancing, but also to assist at the security checkpoints as well in terms of articles needing to be searched. In flight, based on information we have analyzed, the risk of transmission of COVID-19 from one passenger to another passenger on board is very low. Possible reasons are that customers sitting facing forward, not toward each other, seat backs provide a barrier, HEPA filters are utilized in most aircraft, and direction of the airflow on board from ceiling to floor, and the limited movement on board aircraft once seated add to onboard protection. As an added protection against possible in-flight transmission, IATA recommends the use of face coverings by travelers in situations where physical distancing cannot be maintained, including in flight. For those reasons, or in these reasons, physical distancing on board, example, through blocking seats, is not necessary. Comprehensive guidelines have been developed for cabin crew that includes the management of suspected cases of communicable disease on board, for which the World Health Organization has aligned its guidance. This includes advice for simplified self-service, prepackaged catering as example. For added passenger comfort, sanitization wipes could be provided to customers to clean spaces around them, and procedures to limit movement on board to be implemented. Revised guidelines for aircraft cleaning have also been published by IATA, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, and EASA. In terms of the arrival airport, if required by local regulation, non-intrusive mass temperature screening equipment need to be used, and the screening should be conducted with the appropriate social distancing and as efficiently as possible by appropriately trained staff who can safely deal with the possibility of an ill passenger. All parties at the airport should cooperate to ensure that passengers are clearly informed of the measures that are in place and give clear instructions on what they need to do if they develop symptoms of COVID-19 after arrival. All efforts need to be made to provide a speedy baggage claim process and ensure that passengers are not made to wait for excessive amounts of time in the baggage claim area. For example, all available belts should be made use of in order to allow physical distancing. It will also be important that governments ensure that the customs clearance process is as speedy as possible, and that the appropriate measures are taken in the case of physical baggage inspections to ensure physical distancing. In terms of border and customs, where declarations are required on arrival, governments should consider electronic options, mobile applications, and QR codes to minimize human-to-human contact as much as possible. For customs processes, where possible, green/red lanes for self-declarations are recommended. Appropriate sanitary measures must be taken at secondary screening points to protect passengers and staff, and it is suggested that governments should simplify border control formalities by enabling contactless processes. Example, related to reading passport chips, facial recognition, special lane usage, and training of agents to detect signs of unwell passengers. Possible redesign of immigration halls needs to be coordinated between airport, airlines, and governments. In terms of transit operations, any security and health screening requirement for transferring passengers should take maximum advantage of one-stop security arrangements. Avoid duplicating checks done on departure. This relies on mutual recognition of screening measures at the originating airport and eliminates the need for rescreening in the transfer process, thus removing a queuing point in the journey. Where this is not possible for all transfer traffic, considerations should be given to specific arrangements among trusted partners. Where transfer security screening is required, it should follow appropriate social distancing and sanitary requirements as previously described. And where health screening, including temperature checks, may be required, the recommendations for the arrival process should be followed. This temporary multi-layered approach during the restart aims to protect the health and safety of our passengers and crew, and to ensure that air travel, again, is not a vector for COVID-19 transmission. So in conclusion, there is currently no single measure that can mitigate all the biosafety risks of restarting air travel. Implementing the above-mentioned range of measures that are already possible is the most effective way of balancing risk mitigation with the need to unlock economies and to enable travel in the immediate term. As further progress is achieved in terms of the additional measures, such as COVID-19 and immunity testing, new measures can be incorporated into the passenger process to further mitigate the risks and further build confidence in air travel. This will take us further on the journey towards a resumption of normal operations. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, and Alexandre. So the declaration that Alexandre referred to at the beginning will be available on our website for download and reference. We'll also be putting out a press release reflecting that, and also a press release on the passenger process that Nick has just described. We've got some questions in the queue, so we'll start taking those in the order that they were received. So first, a question about entry screening at the airport. Nick, you said that would happen before, that there would be temperature screening at the entry point. Does that mean before security screening? And could this create a security risk of people crowding at the airport doors?
The recommendation would be, we're trying to provide a sterile environment for the airport itself. In order to do so, again, with social distancing measures applied, doing it at the entry point to the terminal building, we believe would be the correct place to put it. However, we recognize that certain terminal buildings, certain layouts, certain geography do not allow for that. So in some cases, there will be variability. So we anticipate that while some airports may do it prior to entry, and keep in mind, entry can be defined wherever you draw the line. And that can be inside some of our very vast check-in halls that primarily are underutilized as it is today with the advancement of self-service. So that's one option. However, we can anticipate that it may be also implemented at the security checkpoint as well. So there will be variation. However, our recommendation is that we try to do it as upfront as possible.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We have another question which says, when do we expect some sort of universal agreement on health measures via ICAO? Some airlines, such as Qantas and Cathay in Asia Pacific, are already independently announcing their own measures.
I can speak to that as well, and Alexandre may want to speak to this. He referenced at the beginning of our announcement in terms of the CART process with ICAO. ICAO and industry, including the World Health Organization, Airports Council International, ICAO, ICC, the manufacturer associations, CANSO for the. We're all working together. The goal is by the end of the month to have sign off on globally recognized recommended practices. And as the airlines that have been referenced, most are consistent with the recommendations that have begun in the early stages from our publications, and now subsequently in the CART process as mentioned. So we're anticipating by month's end we should have that finalized for recommended practices for the industry.
Okay, Alexandre, did you have anything you wanted to add on the CART process?
No, the target date for the CART process to finalize the report and propose guidelines that will be applicable to all ICAO members, meaning everybody, is the end of May, 30th of May or 31st of May.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question about baggage. Should airlines lift checked baggage fees if passengers are told to minimize carry-on? Check
baggage fees, I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what's happened to this industry as we see daily changes to how many airlines are even operating, the greater use of where possible, Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection, government aid, to suggest that cutting off a revenue stream because the changes in processes, I don't think is logical. Customers will have to adapt in terms of, and not every airline is going to these. Again, carry-on baggage is suggestion, it won't be a demand. And so some airlines will, some airlines won't. However, our recommendation is that they do, simply because it will help enable a faster throughput at the security checkpoint, less items on board that could be contaminated, and also to facilitate a decent boarding process. However, we can pack accordingly. And we've seen many examples of that in the past as travelers become more savvy in terms of reducing the amount of ancillary charges that they would anticipate. So the answer to that would be, I would not anticipate that happening. But again, that is up to each individual airline and how they manage their commercial strategy.
Great. Thank you, Nick. We have a question talking about travel corridors. Travel corridors between low-risk states seem to be emerging as a mechanism for the introduction of flights. Are you happy with this model? And do you think it can minimize the negative impact of quarantine measures?
Travel corridors is something that we anticipated would emerge. And the pace at which the operations would resume for the industry, we've seen it play out. Domestic has been first, and we're seeing more and more nations open up the domestic operations, as some were completely ceased. Next, we anticipated there would be a regional growth, and which is what we're seeing now, and then subsequently into more of what we're used to in terms of international traffic. So it is likely and it is logical that we would begin to see certain markets, certain nations open up their borders in recognition of each other's measures. So that is perfectly sustainable. And as this virus takes different, is gradually moving around the world, it's natural as well. So why we would see things in Asia changing faster than things are in North America, as an example. But yes, this is perfectly acceptable as long as they implement the rules that are being suggested, follow the recommended practices, and whatever gets implemented can subsequently get leveraged from one country to the other, so nobody's left out in the end.
Okay, thank you. We have a question talking about the nature of these measures. The measures seem to be rather massive compared to what we have today. Are we confident that passengers will travel under these conditions?
I would look at it on the other side of that and say that without it, passengers will not travel. So I think if one thing this industry is good at is implementing new procedures in a rapid fashion, better than anyone else on the planet, better than any industry in the planet for that matter. So and innovation is key. So yes, they may seem burdensome, but they will be controlled, and we will have time because the load factors will gradually return. And so as we will learn as passenger traffic resumes, and these will be fine-tuned as new systems become available. But this can be done in the most inobtrusive way if we educate our consumers as well. And that will be key, to understand what they need to do to be ready to travel. And their communication campaign will be planned around that, as airlines have already begun, and we will as well.
Okay, thank you. Alexandre, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
No, I think that what we are proposing is the right compromise between, adding necessary procedures to guarantee that the flight is safe and that we minimize any risk of contamination, and a seamless system that will not add too many constraints to the passengers. So we think that passengers will come back, provided they trust the system and the system is not too heavy to deter them from coming. So I'm pretty confident.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked a lot about avoiding the mistakes made after September 11th. Do we have any examples of the kinds of errors or unilateral measures after September 11th to illustrate what we're concerned about in this round?
Well, we have two examples, classical, that are some controls for liquid and some control for the shoes. That first of all are not implemented equally everywhere. You have in some airports you have control for the shoes or for the liquid, in some others you are not. And it's not sure that all these systems are really bringing something additional in terms of security. But perhaps, Nick, you want to comment on that?
I think the security measures that were implemented now have become redundant. They were intended to be removed, and the problem is that nobody has the interest of removing security measures. The checkpoint is a classic example. Prior to 9/11, the throughput of checkpoints were relatively easy. They were done in a risk mitigating fashion. Not 100% of the customers were treated the same way. And there's been billions of dollars spent on machinery within the security checkpoint that were meant to remove the restrictions that Alexandre had mentioned, removing your shoes, emptying your bags, liquids, gels. None of that has changed. We're still doing it. And that includes as well, with respect to whole baggage. Almost unilaterally across the planet now, we have whole baggage screening. Yet we still have to, we should be able to now with that system, trust the system, but we don't. The bags still had to be removed if the traveler is not moving or disenfranchised from their bag, creating security backlogs, delays, lost baggage, you name it. So when you look at what's been implemented post 9/11 in terms of security, these things now, with all the technology that's been implemented, have remained. And that is something that we need to avoid. Meaning that once we're past this, we should not have to be doing all of these security, biosecurity measures that we've referenced. And the worst thing that could happen is that it remains even though it's not necessary.
Great. Thank you, Nick and Alexandre. We have a question about the cost of these measures. Who should pay for the extra measures? Should it be governments, airlines, passengers, or a combination of these?
The fact is that probably the cost or the burden will be shared between the various partners around the table, meaning airlines, governments, airports. Everyone will have to bear its parts, and but we do not expect too many difficulties on that point, because everybody agrees that the system we are proposing, even in terms of cost, is pretty reasonable. But perhaps you want to add something, Nick?
No, I think you covered it well. Most of these, as an example, the majority of what we're suggesting are already there. And so they're more process change than they are technological, with the exception perhaps of the temperature screening. But they're widely available. They are available primarily a large proportion of which are already available in our airports. So we're not anticipating, and have been designed with cost in mind as well. So I don't anticipate there would be that many debates in terms of who pays for what.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about middle seats. Some airlines have chosen to promise empty middle seats because they judge that it helps to reassure passengers, and that reassurance has value, perhaps even competitive value for those carriers. But does this action muddy the waters for IATA's message? And does IATA discourage the practice of leaving the middle seat open?
I can take it first, and then I'm sure Alexandre would like to add to it.
Yeah, please.
In terms of physical distancing on board, most airlines, as you've referenced, or in the question, have said where possible. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And load factors in the beginning will allow for it. And so it's completely logical that they would be offering this as a potential for customers to help encourage them to get back on airplanes again. So it does not fly in the face of a requirement, because they're not saying it's something that needs to be done. They're offering it as a customer service tool, and there's absolutely does not fly in the face of what's being suggested. As load factors return, we will see that that opportunity will be less and less. But in the interim, then where possible, there's nothing wrong with them adding that as a potential for them to increase their traffic and improve customer confidence.
Okay. Alexandre, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No. It's perfectly okay.
Okay. We have a question about our statements that there were few cases of onboard COVID transmission. And the question is, could that be because load factors have also been very low since the start of the outbreak?
No, we have, at this stage, we have several studies made on several flights that were operated even before any protective measures were implemented, and also some after some measures have been implemented, but they are still preliminary. We don't have a very big statistical sample to study that. The study we had still demonstrate a limited contamination case, very limited. We are still working on that issue to see whether we should deepen our knowledge, extend our knowledge, and extend our studies to have a more scientific and statistical meaningful approach. So we are working on that very hard.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about quarantine measures. And essentially what it's saying is, if you have a COVID positive person on an aircraft who's discovered upon arrival, are we concerned that the entire population of that aircraft might have to go into quarantine on arrival? And are there any plans or any opportunities to mitigate this risk for passengers?
It will heavily depend on the policy implemented by each state. But we have to recognize that any quarantine measure is a very deterrent measure for air travel. So it has to be implemented when it's needed, and not too broadly when it is useless. But that's we understand that it's a difficult compromise to find, especially in the case that has been mentioned in the question. Nick, perhaps you have a comment?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all know if quarantine measures are still in place, then our restart effort will be prolonged a lot longer. So the conversations that are currently taking place, in particular between governments, as I mentioned earlier, contact tracing is a significant piece of the puzzle here, and testing as well. So limited testing in terms of the number of people on board is potential, but that is yet to be ironed out in terms of what that would look like. And we are trying to find some terms of harmonization, as some countries will look at repatriation of the in fact impacted individual. There have been some discussions in terms of testing within 3 seats of that 3 rows of that individual, front and back, etc. But that is yet to be completely ironed out in terms of a process. But there's something that is currently being discussed and has to be worked out. But this is a key to unlocking the restart as much faster than possible as we work through what quarantine looks like and how they get restricted movements at the end.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We have a question about the time that it will take for all of these processes. Are we concerned that it will make processing time in airports much longer?
We are modeling it. Once we've got the agreed upon measures, we will be putting some assumptions in place in terms of how long it would take for a passenger to follow through the terminal process. With the use of automatic temperature checks and the fact that a large proportion of the population will go unchecked because they are not exhibiting signs of a temperature, as well as the use of more off-site, so being prepared by the time you get to the airport with your boarding card and potentially your home printed bag tag and where that's allowed, and as we try to unlock those opportunities with other countries to help facilitate movement, we will have a good understanding that airports and airlines can plan the departure process, as well as consumers can understand how much extra time may be needed to get through that. And that includes the boarding process as well, and deplaning will not be as simple as it was in the past either. So we will be modeling that once we finally agreed upon a set of solutions that would work and are acceptable.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about passenger information. We've talked about collecting this information as part of our multi-layered approach. What information exactly are we planning to collect? And I guess the second part of that is who should be responsible for collecting it?
Would you like me to take that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, please, Nick.
So there's two. The second part of the question is governments to consumer. In terms of the advanced passenger information that we're requiring for health declaration as well as contact tracing. So we profess that the airlines do not want to be caught in the middle of that. This needs to be between the consumer and the government. The type of health questions are the similar type of health questions that we're being asked globally when we go to the grocery store. Have you traveled? Have you exhibited symptoms, etc.? Have you had a temperature, headache, and so on? We have and have suggested a standard template for that. That again would be part of the recommended processes when we finally get there, and as well as contact tracing. Where have you been? Where have you going? How can I reach you? This will be also part of the information, including the seat that you're sitting in. So you can anticipate, and most airlines are doing this today, once you're in your seat, you can't change anymore for that simple purpose of the criticality of contact tracing. But again, to answer your question, this questions will be similar. The information is very related to health and contact tracing, and we want that to be between the consumer and the government directly.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about certification against whatever global standards are arrived at. Do we foresee or do we plan to offer a formal registration and testing service for airports, airlines, governments to ensure that the rules or recommendations are implemented?
That's a very timely question, actually. We will be on a call this afternoon, or I will, and I'm participating on a call this afternoon with ICAO as we look at how do we ensure measures are implemented. Fortunately for this industry, we are one of the better ones in terms of utilizing audited processes. IOSA is one of the best examples of that globally in terms of an integrated operational safety audit program. So we would anticipate we'll be approaching it in two ways. One will be through our existing auditing processes, ISAGO and IOSA, and we will also be looking at potentially creating a new format for health procedures only through our CEIV program, which we currently have in place for the transportation of live animals, pharmaceuticals, etc., which is widely accepted within our industry. And also we have to take into consideration the partnership with Airports Council International, as they also have a program that they will potentially utilize for the airports. So yes, the short answer is yes, we're looking at this. Yes, regulatory bodies are asking us for it, and it is squarely on our radar, and we will have something in place to ensure that these processes and recommended practices and standards are being followed.
Okay. After 9/11, a lot of measures were introduced as temporary or stopgap, and yet they seem to have stayed. How are we going to ensure that these measures are sort of sunsetted as necessary?
Among the initial key principles that the restart task force of ICAO has discussed is the principle of eliminating the measures when they are not anymore necessary. So it has been clearly stated by all governments, authorities, organizations, industries around the table that the necessity to get rid of the measures when they become useless is absolutely a major principle. So now we have to implement it.
We have a question about social distancing. How do you reconcile the recommendations for social distancing everywhere along the travel ribbon against the position that as soon as someone comes on board an aircraft, it doesn't matter? And more significantly, do you think passengers will be convinced that there's a difference between the onboard environment and the environment elsewhere in the travel process?
We do not say that it is the need for social distancing is independent of the measures that will be implemented for sanitary check and health control. It is we can limit social distancing on board, provided all the passengers have gone through this sanitary check and control process. So with the equipment, with the temperature check, with the health declaration, and the sanitizing of aircraft, all what Nick has described. So it is absolutely linked. Additionally, the aircraft, the environment of inside the aircraft is also something that is not contributing to contamination. First of all, the air condition and the airflow, which goes from the ceiling to the floor, with an air which is filtered or comes from the outside of the aircraft, or the fact that we are sitting rows after rows, so facing the back of a seat and not facing another passenger. So when we pile up all these elements, we think that it's not necessary to ask for special social distancing on board. But it means that the processes, the control and sanitary processes are in place and respected.
And just to add to that, I mean, this has become the normal way of life for everyone. And it's in line with majority of governments as well as World Health Organization and that's where the masks are critical. What's recommended for most, whether you're traveling on a bus, a train, a subway, in a grocery store that has confined spaces where social distancing cannot be allowed, they recommend the use of a mask. And so that is consistent. And so why airlines would be any different would defy logic, actually. It's just optics.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We have a question about the number of announcements or indications from governments that there will be 14-day quarantine proposals implemented as lockdowns come to an end. Are we becoming increasingly concerned about these? And what are we doing to I suppose, avoid that? Or what alternatives are we proposing?
We are concerned about the deployment of such measures of quarantine because it's a major deterrent to air travel and limitation to air travel. And additionally, we think that, again, if we implement properly an harmonized set of measures for health control and sanitary check for passengers, plus cleaning, plus cleaning of aircraft, plus everything that Nick has described, requiring a quarantine, systematic quarantine for all arrivals is not necessary. So we are advocating against this measure and in favor of the implementation of this harmonized sanitary check and health control measures implemented everywhere equally.
Okay. We have a question about, I suppose, our hopefulness on mutual recognition and harmonization of standards. The question is, do you really believe you can achieve mutual recognition of testing procedures, given that in terms of security, years after 9/11, we still have to go through 3, 4, or 5 security checks on a long-haul trip with transit stops?
We hope that we will achieve that. When we talk about security, we have mentioned that there are differences. There are still between countries and our airports, that there are still some inconsistency in the security process. But globally, it is now pretty consistent all over the world. The point is whether or not the governments will ask to multiply the checking point for health and sanitary control. That's a point we hope we'll be able to avoid, but that will depend on the mutual confidence that governments have between them. We know that. Not new.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question about the responsibility for determining whether a passenger is fit to fly. It was mentioned that passengers should determine whether they're well enough to travel, but would that be acceptable given that an individual's desire to travel might outweigh their common sense? At the moment, if an airline takes a passenger to a country where they don't have the required visa, etc., it's the airline's responsibility to bring that passenger back. Would it be fair to introduce similar types of rules for COVID-19?
Good question.
Yeah, that is a difficult question. Self-declaration is done in the process today. It's in particular around the items you have in your checked luggage. Lithium batteries, explosives, things that you're not aware of. We all sign off on those, and then we're accountable for them. Can you put measures in place that deals with the 1% that can't follow anybody's rules or instructions and are prepared to put themselves ahead of everybody else? Well, that's why all the other layers are in place. So if somebody is developing symptoms or has symptoms and chooses to travel, we anticipate that they would be identified through the checks that we were putting in place. For those that do go through and end up at an arrival airport and testing positive or being identified, then the repatriation, that's a discussion that has yet to take place in terms of who would be responsible for that. It is a very good question. And that would have to be something that definitely would require some further thinking.
We have a couple more questions, and I know, Alexandre, you might have a hard stop at 3 o'clock Geneva time. Nick, do you have a few extra minutes if we have a few other questions?
Sure. No.
Okay. Great. So first question is, what impact will this ready-to-travel approach mean for airport retailers and the economics of airport operators? Could this also translate to an increase in airport taxes and charges for airlines and passengers?
Given the fact that most of what's in the airport now in terms of a retail environment is on the other side of security, the impact should be minimal in that regard. So I don't anticipate that would have a significant impact in terms of rate charges and fees. There's still a significant number of staff at the airport, still a significant number of travelers eventually in the airport. So on air side, the impact would be minimal anyway.
Okay. We have a question about the measures. They seem to be fine for identifying people displaying symptoms, but what are you proposing as measures for asymptomatic travelers or people simply carrying the virus without knowing it?
Our system is not is not directed to these type of cases. We know that it's they are posing problems to all health control and sanitary checks. And that's as long as we don't have a testing system that is not reliable.
Yeah,
but that's true for all systems. Huh?
But again, and as well, I mean, asymptomatic, we seem to be, obviously concerned about that, but that is why the sanitary processes, the social distancing where possible, wear masks, the additional, the reduction and changes in process in terms of boarding, security checks, onboard the aircraft and catering, managing movement on board, all these things, whether you're asymptomatic or actually get through and actually have it, the system is designed to prevent the spread as much as possible, regardless of either two scenarios. So, as best we can with the absence of testing, which Alexandre had mentioned.
Okay. Sure. And Nick, I suppose contact tracing also plays a role in that?
Contact tracing, if your kids are in high school now and they need a job, forensic contact tracing, detective work is a future career opportunity. It is robust as it's ever been, and it's growing rapidly. And with the absence of testing and the absence of statistics with respect to immunity passports, this is the key to everything.
Okay. We have a question, follow-up on the data question we had before. Who would own the data that would be collected, and what data protections would need to be involved in order to ensure that there aren't breaches?
The consumer owns the data. The process that's being discussed is that the data is only referenced when it needs to be, and it would be purged after a certain period of time. So it would be between the consumer and the government through the government process, and it would be utilized when and if it's required. Anything that is put in place now is built with security by design. So the data would be protected like anything else is in terms of passport information, API, PNR information that the airlines are responsible for. So it would be developed with security by design. It would be managed between the consumer and the government. The government will ultimately be responsible for purging it when it's no longer required. And again, there would be debates about whether or not you want to opt into that, and that's up to the individual consumer whether or not they are prepared to provide that information. And from what we've seen in the past, the greater majority of consumers out there are prepared to provide the information necessary, and it's in the 80% range in order to allow for a smooth process at the airport. And don't anticipate this will be any different.
Okay. And then we'll do one last question, combining actually a couple of questions that we have in the queue. Essentially what the question is asking is how close are we to governments reaching an agreement on some sort of global standard approach to this? And the second part of that is how close are we to these measures actually being put into effect?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first. The measures themselves are already being put into effect in various forms by the airlines themselves, because of the fact that they want to get moving, they want to operate. So some airlines have branded it themselves. There have been numerous examples of that. Other airlines and governments have simply been implementing them without any fanfare, and they're all pretty much in line with the guidance that has been suggested early on. Fortunately, this stuff has been in development for about 6 weeks, if not even longer than that. So it's been out there. So they're widely and broadly being accepted. And the critical point for us in terms of our advocacy will be the end of May, as described, when the CART process completes and ICAO recommends the guiding principles that we've been working on for the last number of weeks. And that will be a critical factor. Also worth mentioning, which we didn't probably in the presentations, we're also doing individual outreaches with all the various countries within our jurisdictions from a regional perspective, and there's broad support for this. We have very few instances where there isn't. And for those that where we do see it, we spend more time trying to understand why, and then eventually try to get to an agreement. So I would say characterize it as probably one of the more accepted practices or recommendations that I've seen so far in terms of government support to implement.
Great. I make it about 5 or so minutes past 3 o'clock now, Geneva time. So I think we'll call this briefing to a close.